So in 1990, our family packs up in the Philippines, heads back to Washington, D.C., arranged to put our children in school, and I go to the State Department to begin my assignment as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the East Asia Pacific Bureau, working on all of Southeast Asia, but particularly Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. I didn't realize it at the time, but this would be an incredibly complex and difficult set of issues to work on, and that would involve so many different parties, different interests, all coming together and trying to figure out how in the middle of all of this to obtain American interests, particularly in Vietnam and Cambodia. Those two countries had been so central to U.S. policy. When I entered the Foreign Service, we had a war, 500,000 plus troops on the ground in Vietnam. And now, 1990, 15 years after the end of the war, the North Vietnamese capture of Saigon, the American ambassador fleeing in a helicopter, the U.S. had no diplomatic relations with Vietnam, with the communist government in Hanoi, which had unified the country, no diplomatic relations with Cambodia. We did have a relationship and an embassy in Laos. And on top of that, we had so many other players in Southeast Asia. So as I went to my first day at the office, working for a wonderful man, Assistant Secretary Richard Solomon, China expert who had worked at the National Security Council and the Kissinger and Ford administration, where I met him and said, we're going to be partners in trying to bring American interests all together from 1990 to 94. Cambodia, which had suffered under the Khmer Rouge, 2 million people dead in 4 years out of the 7 million total population of the country as a result of the terrible Khmer Rouge policies, emptying all the cities. So here was a country, Cambodia, that needed to somehow be brought back to life. U.S. had main interest. Our main policy was to account for the still 2,500 plus U.S. servicemen, they were all men, who were still not accounted for after the war. Some were dead, but their bodies hadn't been recovered. Others, their fate was still not certain. Were there any alive? Could we get into Vietnam, into Cambodia, to look for and recover their bodies, find evidence about their deaths? So the main policy goal for the United States was, can we account for those missing men? Can we account for those POW MIAs? And so to do this, we would have to deal with an incredible array of different actors, both within Indochina, internationally, and even within the United States, and somehow blend all of these interests and issues and actors together. It's important to realize and remember what had happened in 1975 after the U.S. withdrew from Indochina when the war had ended. In 1979, U.S. and China had established diplomatic relations. The Chinese were strongly interested in ensuring, to the best of their possibility, that the Soviet Union, whom they feared might invade China, could use Southeast Asia, Vietnam, where the Soviets had such a strong presence. They could use Southeast Asia as a way of attacking in southern parts of China. And so now the U.S. and China had relationship. But in 1979, the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese Communist Army had invaded Cambodia, had driven the Khmer Rouge from all of the cities because the Khmer Rouge had come into Cambodia, come into Vietnam and slaughtered Vietnamese civilians. And so North Vietnam now had several 100,000 troops in Cambodia. China considered this an insult to Deng Xiaoping because the invasion came right before he was coming to the United States. And as a result, China had attacked into Vietnam in 1979. And from 79 to 90, there was no Chinese-Vietnamese relationship. No diplomatic relationships, no trading relationships. So in Cambodia, there's still 25,000 or more Khmer Rouge active all over the country. And Vietnamese troops there, the Chinese interest, and then you have the Southeast Asian nations, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, so worried about the balance of power and looking to the U.S. to be protective of them. And on top of all this, there were issues in the United States of politics that was involved, accounting for POWs. It was unbelievably complex. So many different parts, so many different actors. And it would be my job to find a way to construct a policy that could bring all of these elements together, achieve U.S. goals, hopefully try to put Cambodia back together so that the poor Cambodian people who had suffered so incredibly could be helped, and to have the U.S.-Vietnamese relationship as such that we would get accounting for our still missing men from the Vietnam War. It would be an incredible diplomatic puzzle, and I would have to find a roadmap through it.